Welcome once again to Berlin Psychoanalytic. This is the first of a series of videos on the life and work, mostly the work, of Jacques Lacan, a French psychiatrist who is a very influential but polemic author and teacher in psychoanalysis. His influence and also his controversies last until today, and as such I would like to tell all the people who are watching the channel right now that I'm going to be doing this series of videos, but there might be people who have a different view on the life of Lacan, but most importantly on his work and on his contributions to psychoanalysis. There are different schools of psychoanalysis that get a certain criticism by other schools, but in the case of Lacan, you get that apart from criticism, there is also a certain animosity that lasts until today, 45 years from his death. Jacques Lacan was a French psychiatrist who explored various models of psychiatry before finding psychoanalysis to be the most helpful for him. He believed that Freudian theory was a work in progress and drew inspiration from other fields, such as biology, psychology, philosophy, mathematics, to develop his own theory. Lacan's teachings were mostly delivered through speeches and seminars, oral seminars, and his written works are very much obscure and difficult to understand. His theories are best understood in the context of therapy, but are often discussed in philosophy departments rather than in clinical settings due to the complexity of his vocabulary and writing style. In spite of this, Lacan tried to keep some intellectual rigor in both his classes and in his writings. Besides his own effort in being rigorous and intellectually at least, his clinical models, as I was telling you at the beginning, they remains clinically relevant. And as a Latin American psychoanalyst, I can tell you that in Latin America, Lacan is a very, very influential author, and that many psychoanalytic therapists and psychodynamic therapists will work with Lacan as a base. The 1920s saw psychoanalysis break free from its parental boundaries, basically of the German-speaking world, and it started to be courted by other disciplines across Europe. In France, the science of psychoanalysis grew up with psychotic patients, basically, in mental asylums and hospitals, a very different context than in Vienna, for example, with neurotics, and France was kind of a late developer, only being embraced by the medical establishment, psychoanalysis, by the 1920s. There were two department heads at the Saint-Anne hospitals in Paris, Henri Claude and Gaëtan de Clérambault. Excuse my French, literally. And they have a far-reaching impact on the development of French psychoanalysis. So Henri Claude in the Saint-Anne hospital allowed Eugénie Solnikha, an ex-patient of Freud, who was allowed to analyze younger psychiatrists in the mental unit, in the psychiatry unit. This group went on to become the founders members of the Paris Psychoanalytic Society, which is the most important psychoanalytical organization in France until today. The controversial Clérambault was an extraordinary clinician who left his name, for example, to a form of paranoid disorder called the Clérambault syndrome, or what we call the erotomanic delusion or erotomania. His brilliance inspired Jacques Lacan, who was younger and who would go on to adapt his style of meticulous clinical observation, Clérambault style, to psychoanalysis. Like many of the founder members of the French psychoanalytic movement, Jacques Lacan studied at the Faculty of Medicine in Paris and completed his psychiatric training at Saint-Anne's Hospital, there in Paris too. However, he was a few years younger than the founding members of the movement and had to wait several years before he could attain an actual membership to the group. French psychoanalysis was closely linked with medical psychiatry, and its proponents were dealing with extreme cases such as acute and chronic psychosis, also bipolar or manic depression. Lacan, in the 30s, spent 2 months at the Burg Hölzli, a mental asylum in Zurich, where he worked under Hans Wolfgang Meyer, who was the successor of Eugene Bleuler, the asylum's most illustrious and famous director. Bleuler was an assistant to Carl Jung and took Freud's idea from the domain of neurosis into psychosis, challenging the prevailing belief that psychosis was the result of just organic brain damage. He insisted that it could be psychologically explained. Bleuler thought that Freud's way of seeing the mind could actually explain to deliria and hallucinations in psychosis. When Lacan went back to Paris, he completed his medical thesis, which contains a case study of a woman suffering from Clérambault's passionate psychosis or erotomania, and incorporates Bleuler's ideas of the meaningfulness of delusion, that delusion means something. However, the case of Aimé, that is commonly known, this thesis, Lacan drew inspiration from different sources, particularly from Surrealism, which had begun to associate with. He started meeting Surrealist artists. Shortly after presenting his thesis, Lacan began his own analysis with Rudolf Lowenstein, a Polish-born analyst that was one of the founding members of the Society in Paris. However, the relationship between Lowenstein and Lacan was somewhat conflictual, and Lowenstein questioned Lacan's analyzability, while Lacan questioned Lowenstein's talent and intellect. In 1934, Lacan applied for membership of the Paris Society and was granted the candidate member status. He was granted full membership 4 years later. In 1936, at the International Psychoanalytic Association meeting at Marienbad, Lacan presented his first paper, The Mirror Stage, something that we're going to see in next videos. And this remains one of the most important works in the fields of psychoanalytic theory, particularly Lacanian theory. His presentation at the conference was, though, cut short, which caused tension between Lacan and the psychoanalytic establishment of the time. However, hindsight shows that he was right to believe in the extraordinary nature of this work. From the 20s onwards, Lacan moved in an avant-garde intellectual cycles, befriending writings like André Breton, Georges Bataille. He also associated with artists like Salvador Dali and Pablo Picasso, who he greatly admired, and several of his articles were published in the typical surreal and the most famous and one of the first surrealist magazines, the Minotaur. Lacan's intellectual journey was marked by a tension between his own ideas and those of his teachers and peers, as well as a strong sense of self-belief. In the beginning of the 50s, even when Lacan being part of the Paris Society, there were some intellectual and power struggles within the Paris Society, and a group broke off with Lacan in this group, which started being called the French Psychoanalytic Society instead of the Paris Psychoanalytic Societies. One of the ideological and, let's say, technical struggles was the idea of Lacan, the innovation by Lacan, we could say, that was the use of variable duration sessions, which lasted between 10 and 40 minutes, in contrast to the traditional psychoanalytic 50 minutes, 1 hour session. This practice, which now is known as the short sessions, was viewed with suspicion by the establishment of psychoanalytic community at the time, who feared that it would lead to an abuse of power by the analyst and undermine the credibility of psychoanalysis as a discipline. Furthermore, the use of short sessions allowed Lacan to accept a greater number of trainees than other training analysts, which raised concerns that he would command the loyalty of a majority of the newly trained psychoanalysts in this group. These ideological rifts within the French psychoanalytic community were more exacerbated by the increasing influence of the American psychoanalytic movement, which sought to regulate the training and accreditation of psychoanalysts at the time. The IPA, the International Psychoanalytic Association, insisted that a formalized system of accreditation should be used, and the Society of Paris was required to produce a set of rules in line with those EPA requirements, if they want to get IPA recognitions. No? Two currents then emerged within the Paris Society: the conservatives, who favored a medical model and sought to establish an institute of psychoanalysis to implement the IPA standards of training, and the liberals, who preferred a more psychological model and opposed the rigidity of the planned institute. Despite being a doctor, a medical doctor himself, Lacan sided with the liberals. And shortly after he became president of the Paris Society, he resigned from it. Lacan then joined the group of liberals led by Daniel Lagrange, who left the Paris Society to form the French Society in 1953. The French Society sought recognition from the IPA, but it fell in the same trap that the Paris Society had fallen by attempting to demonstrate to the IPA that its standards of training follow IPA rules. But Lacan's use of the short sessions provoked a crisis, and the IPA refused to affiliate the French Society and directed a fact-finding commission led by no one else than Donald Winnicott to examine this application. So, in spite of the IPA's negative views on Lacan's use of short sessions and his seductive influence on trainees, Lacan continued to develop and disseminate his theories, presenting his paper The Symbolic, the Imaginary and the Real, and the Function and Feel of Speech and Language in Psychoanalysis, things we're going to see in further videos, shortly after the schisms with the Paris Society. The finding of the IPA committee meant that Lacan and François Dolto, another prominent child psychoanalyst, will not have professional recognition as training analysts. The discrepancy with, and the hostility that Lacan attracted from critics and the status he held in the eyes of his admirers posed a great problem for the international regulators, of course. Negotiations between the Paris Society and the IPA did continue, and in 1959, the Executive Committee of the IPA decided to create a new committee to re-examine the application of the French Association. The committee arrived in Paris in May 1961 to interrogate members of the French Society, and their findings will shape the future of psychoanalysts in France until now. Lacan's attitude and behavior towards the IPA were arrogant and were childish, but the commission that recommended his expulsion was also problematic because they focused on this personality he had rather than his theoretical ideas and technical basis. In spite of his expulsion, several leading French psychoanalysts trained by Lacan went to become prominent members of the IPA later, including Daniel Wittlocher, who even became his president later. Probably Lacan's oppositional attitude against the IPA was rooted in his belief that the kind of regulation that the IPA was looking for, was trying to impose, was fundamentally wrong. He argued that psychoanalysis, as a young and evolving field, should not be bound by the structures imposed by any group of people. Lacan believed that Freud's theory and practice continued to change and continued to develop until the end of his life. In spite of his expulsion from the IPA, Lacan's influence continued to grow during his life, particularly in intellectual circles in the United States, where he was popular among students of literature and philosophy. He addressed a colloquium at Johns Hopkins University in 1966, for example, and in 1968, a group of Lacanian-trained analysts established a department of psychoanalysis at the University of Vincennes, or Paris 8, with Lacan being his scientific director until 1974. In 1980, he dissolved the Paris Society and set up the École de la Cause Freudienne, the School of the Freudian Cause. Lacan died at the end of 80 years old, still not having accreditation from the IPA, but having lived to see that his work would survive his own life for a very long time.